The vibrations of the truck's engine had long since worked their way up from the wooden bench through my bones, a constant dull thrumming that was the only steady thing left in the world. I remember staring out from under the grimy canvas top, watching this endless, foreign landscape unspool like some kind of terrible, boring film. It wasn't the Germany I knew, all tidy fields and forests. This was Russia, and it felt old, ancient, and hostile. The fields were vast, impersonal, the kind of open space that makes a man feel small and exposed. The villages we rattled past were just clusters of weathered log isbas, and the people, when we saw them, would just stop and stare with these flat, unreadable eyes. You couldn't tell if they hated us or pitied us or just didn't care anymore. The further east we drove, the more the air itself changed. At first, back near the railhead, there was still some chatter, a few of the new guys trying to sing marching songs, their voices thin and reedy against the wind. But that died out after a few hours. The air grew heavy, and you started to taste this faint, metallic tang at the back of your throat. It was a smell I'd never encountered before, a mix of wet earth, diesel fumes, and something else, something sour and chemical. Fear, I realized later. I was smelling the collective fear of thousands of men seeping into the very soil. The sounds changed, too. The steady roar of the engine was now punctuated by a distant, rhythmic thumping, like a giant, diseased heart beating somewhere just over the horizon. At first it was so low you felt it more than heard it, a pressure in your ears. But with every kilometer, it grew louder, more distinct. Artillery, the rumble of the big guns. Some of the veterans in the truck, the few being sent back from leave, would just close their eyes when a particularly loud one echoed, their faces tightening. They didn't have to say a word. Their exhaustion was a language of its own. They were covered in a fine grey dust that clung to their worn uniforms, and their eyes, when they bothered to look at us green replacements, were just hollow, empty, like looking into a house where everyone had long since moved out. We were just kids to them, fresh meat for the grinder, and they didn't have the energy to even be resentful. I felt like an imposter in my relatively clean Feldgrau, my gear still smelling of depot leather and polish, not sweat and cordite. My head was full of nonsense from the training manual, how to parade a ground march, the theory of a fixed bayonet charge. It all felt so stupid and childish now, like I'd brought a textbook to a knife fight. The real lesson was in the way that one veteran, a corporal with a scar running through his eyebrow, kept running his thumb over the edge of his entrenching tool, over and over, a nervous, rhythmic tick that was more articulate than any lecture. When the trucks finally groaned to a halt and the tailgate crashed down, the noise hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just one sound, it was a wall of chaos. The crump of distant explosions, the stuttering bark of a machine gun miles away, the sharper crack of rifle fire, the whine and buzz of things flying through the air that you couldn't see. It was so loud you couldn't hear the man next to you unless he shouted right into your ear. The sergeant who greeted us was a block of a man, his face a mask of gristle and grim patience. He didn't welcome us. He just started barking names, his voice raspy from years of shouting over this very din. The air here was thick with the smell of turned earth, of mud and decay, and underneath it all, that persistent chemical smell of high explosives. It coated your tongue. We were led in a daze through a labyrinth of trenches, just deep gashes in the brown earth, the walls shored up with rough-hewn logs that were splintered and torn in places. Water pooled at the bottom, a filthy, icy slurry that seeped into my boots. Men were huddled everywhere, leaning against the dirt walls, some trying to sleep, others just staring into nothing. They looked ancient, their faces caked in mud and stubble, their uniforms stiff with dirt. They barely glanced at us as we passed. I felt their stares like a weight, a silent judgment. I was stepping into a world that had already chewed up and spat out better men than me. Then the sergeant stopped in front of a dugout, little more than a hole in the side of the trench covered with a rain-sodden tarpaulin. He ducked inside and came out with a mess kit and a canteen. He thrust them into my hands. The metal of the mess kit was dented and scuffed, and there, scratched crudely into the lid, was a name. H. Weber. I turned it over in my hands, my own fingers tracing the grooves of the letters. It wasn't mine. This belonged to someone else, a man who wasn't here anymore. The weight of that simple aluminum kit felt like a tombstone in my hands. The sergeant must have seen the look on my face because he grunted. He won't be needing it. You're in his spot. Keep your head down, do what you're told, and you might last long enough to get your own name scratched in. That was it. That was my orientation. My entire preparation for the Eastern Front was holding a dead man's dinner plate and a warning. The finality of it sank into my gut, cold and heavy. I wasn't just a soldier anymore. I was a replacement, a stand-in for a ghost. I was filling a hole, and the front had a nasty habit of making new ones. They stuck me in a section with a few other replacements, and a handful of veterans who seemed to have been carved from the same hard wood as the trench supports. My foxhole partner, the man I'd be sharing this sliver of mud with, was an older guy from Hamburg named Karl. He had a quiet, weary way about him. He didn't say much at first, just gave me a slow, appraising look, then nodded toward a space next to him. "Dig," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Deeper is better." So I dug. My hands, soft from training, blistered quickly, the muddy water stinging the raw flesh. The fear was a constant companion now, a tight knot in my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was a cold, crawling feeling on the back of your neck, a constant anticipation of the unknown. You'd hear the whistle of a shell, and your whole body would clench, waiting for the impact, trying to gauge the distance. Were there two whistles? Was it getting louder? Your heart would hammer against your ribs like it was trying to escape. You'd think of home, not in a grand, patriotic way, but in small, stupid details. The smell of your mother's potato soup, the feel of your own bed, the sound of rain on a quiet rooftop, not this monstrous, earth-shattering rain of steel. The veterans had a dark humor about it all, a way of laughing at the absurdity that kept them sane. They'd give names to the different Soviet artillery pieces based on the sound they made. A moaning wail was a sewing machine. A sudden, sharp crack was Stalin's doorbell. They'd joke about the rations, the mud, the lice that were our constant, crawling companions. You'd sit there, picking the vermin from the seams of your tunic, and the guy next to you would say, "Careful, that one's a corporal. He's in charge of the platoon on your left sleeve." It was madness, but it was the only way to cope. You had to laugh, or you'd just start screaming and never stop. And then it happened. The moment the last shred of my boyhood illusion was torn away. It started with a sound different from the rest, a shrieking tear in the sky that grew from a whisper to a deafening roar in seconds. It was coming right for us. I'd heard explosions before, but always at a distance. This was personal. My training vanished. My mind went blank, white with pure animal terror. I fumbled for my rifle, my hands slick and clumsy, and then I was just scrambling, falling face first into the mud at the bottom of the trench. The world dissolved into a deafening blast that hit me in the chest, followed by a shower of dirt and debris raining down. I was choking, gasping, my ears ringing so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. I pushed myself up, spitting out mud, my entire body trembling uncontrollably. And then I saw Karl. He hadn't even flinched. He just sunk a little lower into the trench, his shoulders hunched, his eyes calmly scanning the parapet. He saw me there, covered in filth, shaking like a leaf, and he didn't look disgusted or scornful. He just gave me a slow, grim nod. It was in that instant, crouched in that freezing mud, the acrid smell of cordite burning my nostrils, the taste of earth in my mouth, that I understood. This wasn't the adventure I'd read about in books back home. This wasn't about glory or fatherlands or any of the grand words they used in the propaganda newsreels. This was primordial. This was about the next breath, the next second. This was about the man next to you and the simple, brutal fact of survival. The boy who had climbed into that truck days ago was gone, buried in that first crater. What was left was something harder, something colder, a creature of instinct whose world had shrunk to the dimensions of a muddy hole in the ground. The Eastern Front didn't care about your name, your dreams, or your politics. It only measured your life in inches of dirt and seconds of luck. And my first day had just begun. You never really know the weight of a thing until you carry it with you through hell. I'm not talking about the rifle, though the Carabiner 98K was no feather. It's cold steel against your shoulder day and night. I'm talking about the small things, the things you carried in your pockets, close to your skin. They had a different kind of weight, a weight of the soul. The first thing I'd touch, every single time, before a patrol during a bombardment, was the photograph. It was worn soft at the edges, the creases so deep my wife's smile was almost carved into the paper. I kept it in my tunic pocket, right over my heart, a silly, romantic gesture maybe, but it felt necessary. My fingers would find it, and for a second I wasn't in the frozen mud of Russia. I was in our kitchen in Hamburg, the smell of coffee filling the air, my daughter's laughter ringing from the next room. I could feel the warmth of that memory, a physical warmth that fought back the cold for just a moment. Then my fingers would brush against the 2 extra pairs of socks rolled up tight next to the photo. Now, to anyone who hasn't been there, that sounds ridiculous. Socks. But let me tell you, in the autumn Rasputitsa, that bottomless sea of mud, and then the winter frost that could freeze the blood in your veins, a dry pair of socks was more valuable than a general's medal. It was the difference between marching and being left behind, between keeping your feet and losing them to the gangrene that smelled so sweet and foul we'd all gag. That simple wool was a tiny shield against the indifference of this vast, hateful land. And then there was the knife. Just a simple pocket knife my father gave me when I enlisted. He didn't say much, just clapped me on the shoulder and pressed it into my hand. It wasn't a weapon, not really. I had my bayonet for that ugly business. This was for opening tins, whittling a piece of wood to pass the time, cutting a loose thread. It felt solid in my palm, a tangible link to a world where tools were for building and fixing, not for killing. Running my thumb over the bone handle, smooth and familiar, I could almost see my father's workshop, smell the sawdust. Those 3 things in my pocket were my anchor. They were proof that another life existed, that the man I was before this nightmare was still in here somewhere, buried under the filth and the fear. We all had our rituals, little things we did to keep the madness at bay. They were never spoken about, but you saw them, you understood. Every evening, if there was a lull, the boys would pull out their writing kits. We'd find a crate to sit on, or just lean against the dirt wall of the trench, and we'd write letters we knew might never be sent. The mail service was a joke, a fragile thread stretched over a continent at war. But we wrote anyway. I described the sky, how the stars were so clear and cold out here, nothing like the hazy lights of the city. Tell my wife about the birds I'd seen, stupid, mundane details, because I could never, ever tell her the truth. I couldn't write about the way the Russian shells sounded like a train tearing the sky apart, or the way the ground shook so hard it felt like the earth was having a fit. I couldn't describe the smell, God, the smell cordite, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and underneath it all, the coppery stench of blood and the rotten egg stink of the latrines. So I wrote about the stars. And then there was the food. Our rations were meager, always the same dreary black bread, the ersatz jam that tasted like sweetened sawdust, the thin sausage that was more fat than meat. But when someone managed to get a parcel from home with real coffee or a bar of chocolate, it became a shared treasure. That was an unspoken rule. Klaus, a big farm boy from Bavaria, once got a huge wheel of cheese from his family. He didn't hoard it. He just took out his knife, cut it into chunks, and passed it around. No words were needed. In that simple act of sharing, we weren't soldiers of the Reich. We were just a bunch of hungry boys, and for a minute we were a brotherhood. That bond, forged over a piece of cheese or a shared cigarette, was stronger than any oath we'd sworn. It was a bond of survival. And then there was the ritual of cleaning my rifle. It was a practical necessity, of course. A dirty rifle could jam, and a jammed rifle could get you killed. But it was more than that. It was a meditation. Sitting in the flickering light of a candle or a small fire, disassembling the bolt, running the oily rag through the barrel, the repetitive motions were soothing. The smell of the solvent cut through the other stench. For those 10 or 15 minutes, my mind was empty of everything except the task. There was no past, no future, just the smooth metal parts in my hands, the methodical cleaning. It was a small island of order in a world of absolute chaos. It was the only thing in that whole damned place that I felt I had any control over. But the worst time, the time that truly tested your nerve, was the silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence between the storms. After a barrage would lift, the sudden quiet was deafening. Your ears would ring from the explosions, but underneath that high-pitched whine was nothing, an oppressive, heavy silence that pressed down on you worse than any noise. You'd be crouched in your hole, the dirt still trickling down from the walls, the air thick with dust and smoke, and you'd just wait. You'd listen so hard your ears hurt. You de-strain to hear the crunch of a boot, the click of a bolt, the whisper of a command from the other side. That's when the fear would really set in, a cold, crawling fear that started in your gut and crept into your bones. because you knew they were out there in their trenches, maybe 100 meters away, maybe less. You'd start to wonder about them. Were they as scared as we were? Did they have photographs in their pockets too? Did they share their miserable rations? Were they just boys like us, dragged into this meat grinder by old men in fancy uniforms? Sometimes, on a still night, you could hear them. A cough, a faint murmur of voices. It was a strange feeling, hearing the enemy not as some faceless monster, but as a man clearing his throat. It made it all so much harder. And then, sometimes, one of our guys, usually France, would pull out his harmonica. He'd play some sad, slow folk tune, something from home. And in that silence, that terrible waiting silence, the music would drift across Naaman's land, so pure and so full of longing it could bring tears to your eyes. No one would say a word. We'd just sit there, listening, each of us lost in our own private thoughts of home. For a few minutes, the war stopped. There were no Germans, no Russians, just a bunch of homesick boys under the same cold, indifferent stars. Then a shot would ring out, or a flare would go up, and the spell would be broken. The war would start again, but for that brief moment, we'd been human. You had to fight to hold on to a flicker of yourself, to remember the person you were before you put on this uniform. The world around you was trying its damnedest to strip you of everything, to turn you into an animal, a machine that only knew how to load, aim, and fire. So you clung to the smallest things. I try to remember a song my wife used to sing, humming it under my breath as we marched, the words a private mantra against the rhythm of my boots and the groans of the wounded. It never quite worked. The screaming, the shelling, the officers, shouts would always drown it out, but the effort itself was a kind of resistance. We all had our dreams, not grand dreams of victory or glory, but simple, pathetic dreams. My dream was of a hot meal, not just hot, but a real meal. A plate of my mother's potato pancakes, crispy and golden brown with applesauce on the side. I could almost taste it. And a clean bed. Not a lice-infested straw pallet in a filthy barn, but a real bed with clean sheets that smelled of soap and sunshine. I'd lie awake at night, shivering, and build that dream around me like a fortress. I could feel the weight of the clean blankets, see the morning light through a proper window. That dream kept me going more than any speech from a political officer. But the hardest thing was looking at the veterans, the men who had been here since the summer of '41. Their eyes were empty. They moved with a weary efficiency, they did their jobs, they fought, but the light was gone. There was a hardness to them, a shell that nothing could penetrate. They'd seen too much. They'd lost too many friends. They could joke about things that would make a new guy like me sick to my stomach. I promised myself, I swore it on my family's lives, that I would not become like that. I would not let this place hollow me out. I would hold on to the sadness, the fear, the revulsion, because those feelings, as terrible as they were human. To lose them was to lose everything. That was the real battle, you see, not against the Russians in their trenches across the field. The real battle was inside your own head, a daily, hourly fight to remember that you were a man, a father, a husband, and not just a tool for killing. The weight of the rifle was nothing compared to the weight of that promise I made to myself in the freezing dark. It was a promise that, in the end, was harder to keep than any order I ever received. They told us we'd be home before the snow fell. That's what the officers said, back in Poland, back when the war still felt like a parade. We were invincible then, rolling east in our trucks, the sun on our faces. But the snow came early that year in '41, and it didn't just fall, it swallowed the world. It was so damn white, a blinding, endless white that made your eyes ache, and against that white, the first thing I saw was the red. Not a flag, not a uniform. Blood, bright, shocking red, sprayed across the pure snow like some god-awful painting. I was a sanitator, a medic. I'd trained with clean bandages on healthy boys, learning how to tie a tourniquet on a wooden leg. I thought I knew what to expect. But nothing in this world prepares you for that first one, the one that makes it real. He was a boy from my own company, a kid named Klaus with a laugh that could make you forget the cold for a second. One minute he was joking about the girls back in Hamburg. The next there was that sound I'd learned to hate more than anything, the crack thump of a mortar round finding its mark. The shrapnel caught him in the leg and the belly. I ran to him, my medical bag feeling suddenly stupid and small in my hand. The snow crunched under my boots, and when I dropped to my knees beside him, The cold bit right through my trousers. His blood was so warm, steaming in that frigid air, and it was everywhere, soaking into the white wool of his greatcoat, pooling in the snow beneath him. My hands, they wouldn't stop shaking. I fumbled with the buckle on my bag, my fingers thick and clumsy, my mind a blank slate. All the diagrams, all the lectures from the medical officer just vanished. All that was left was Klaus's eyes. They were wide, wider than I'd ever seen eyes before, full of a terror so pure it was like looking into an animal caught in a trap. And underneath the terror, a plea, a silent, desperate plea that said, "Don't let me die here, please." I remember the smell of it, that coppery, metallic tang of blood mixing with the sharp scent of cordite and the clean, cold smell of the air. I finally got the bandage out, a pathetic little roll of gauze, and pressed it against the mess on his stomach. I told him he was going to be okay, that I had him, all the lies you tell because the truth is too monstrous to speak. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, and he just held on, his eyes locked on mine, and I knew in that moment that I wasn't just trying to stop the bleeding, I was trying to stop the fear. I was his anchor to life, and I felt so utterly inadequate for the job. We got him back to the aid station, a makeshift thing set up in a half-shelled izba, a peasant's hut. And that's when I saw the real war. The front line was hell, but the aid station was a special kind of purgatory. They called it the triage tent, but it was a house of horrors. The air was thick with a smell I can still conjure up 60 years later if I close my eyes, a sweet, sickly smell of blood, layered over with the sharp sting of antiseptic, and underneath it all, the low, foul odor of death, of opened bowels and gangrene. It was a smell that clung to your uniform, your hair, the inside of your nose, a smell that followed you into your sleep. The sounds were worse than the smells, maybe. The low moans, the ragged breathing, the occasional scream that would cut through the murmur of the doctors and the orderlies. And then there was the quiet, the terrible, waiting quiet of the men who were too far gone to make a sound. My first day there, the senior medic, a grizzled old Feldwebel named Bauer who had been a butcher in civilian life, grabbed my arm and pointed to the rows of men laid out on the floor. "You see him," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Femur artery. He's gone in 10 minutes no matter what we do. You see him over there, shrapnel in the lung. If we get to him now, he might make it. You start with him. The other one, you make him comfortable." He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was sorting cuts of meat. That was the impossible choice. Who lives? Who gets a chance? Who do you leave to die? It wasn't about rank or who was the bravest. It was a cold, brutal calculation of anatomy and time. I learned to look at a man and in 5 seconds assess the wreckage of his body and decide his fate. This one gets morphine. This one gets plasma. This one gets a quiet word and a cigarette. I remember one soldier, an older man, his face grey, his stomach a ruin. I knew there was nothing to be done. I gave him a shot of morphine and wiped the grime from his forehead with a damp cloth. He looked up at me, his eyes already clouding over, and he whispered, "Dank, kamerad, thank you." A thank you for ushering him gently into the dark. That gratitude was a knife in my heart. The crushing weight of it all was the guilt. You'd be kneeling beside one man, pressing down on a wound, trying to find a vein for a transfusion, and out of the corner of your eye, you'd see another man reach a hand out, his fingers trembling, and then go still. And you couldn't go to him. You had to stay with the one who had a chance. You had to make the choice to let one man die so that another might live. Every still hand, every last rattling breath you weren't there to hear, felt like a personal failure. The frustration was a physical thing, a burning in your chest. You'd see a terrible wound, a limb hanging by a thread, internal injuries you could only guess at, and all you had were bandages, sulfur powder, and a prayer. We were fighting against the most advanced weapons of the 20th century with little more than what a field doctor had in the time of Napoleon. I remember running out of bandages once during a particularly bad barrage. The supply wagon had been hit on the way up. We were using rags, torn-up shirts, anything we could find. And then I saw it, on a stretcher waiting to be taken to the dead pile, was a buddy of mine, Hans, a good man. He had a medical pouch on his belt, still full, untouched. I had to kneel down next to him, apologize to his lifeless body, and unbuckle that pouch. The leather was cold. Taking those clean bandages and his vial of morphine felt like a violation, but it was a violation I had to commit to save the living. It's a strange thing, the economy of death. You become numb to it in a way. The constant stream of broken bodies, the endless work, it turns you into a machine. You function on coffee, black and bitter as tar, and on cigarettes, those cheap, harsh Russians we trade for with the men from the infantry. You develop a dark humor, a necessary shield against the madness. We joke about things that would make a civilian sick to their stomach. But then, one would get through the armor. One face would etch itself onto your soul forever. For me, it was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 17, fresh-faced, with blonde hair that was still clean. A shell had landed near his foxhole. There wasn't a mark on him, not a scratch, but the concussion had done its work inside. Internal bleeding. There was nothing anyone could do. I sat with him because he was scared and he was so young. I held his hand and his grip was weak, like a child-s. He kept calling for his mother. Mother. Bis duda, Mutter, ease tut so way. Mother, are you there? Mother, it hurts so much. I squeezed his hand and told him she was on her way, that he should rest. I don't know if he believed me. He died like that, holding my hand, his eyes fixed on the canvas roof of the tent, seeing a farmhouse kitchen somewhere in Bavaria instead of this hell. I closed his eyes, wrote his name and unit down on a tag, and that was that. But he stayed with me. He's still with me. After that, I started doing something maybe I shouldn't have. I'd take the dog tags from the ones I'd been with at the end, and I'd try to write a letter home. Not an official notification, those were cold, bureaucratic things. Your son died for the fatherland. Honor his sacrifice. I'd try to write something more. I'd say he was brave, that he wasn't alone, that he spoke of home. I'd lie and say it was quick, that he didn't suffer. I wanted to give those families something more than a void. I realized in those long, freezing nights, huddled over a stub of a candle, that my war was different from the infantrymen's. They fought with rifles and machine guns. Their job was to take life. My job was to save it. And I failed over and over and over again. My war wasn't about killing Russians. It was about failing to save Germans. It was about watching the light leave a young boy's eyes, and knowing that all your training, all your compassion, all your will, meant nothing against the sheer, indifferent physics of shrapnel and high explosives. That's the truth they never tell you. They talk about glory and honor and duty. They never talk about the smell of a wound turning septic, or the weight of a body as you lift it onto a stretcher, or the sound of a man's last breath when he's calling for a mother who will never hear him. They never tell you that the real enemy isn't the soldier across the field. It's the helplessness that creeps into your bones and makes a home there forever. I came home eventually, long after the snows had melted and frozen again a dozen times. I carried no visible wounds, but I brought the war back with me, in my head, in my dreams. I still see that white snow, that red blood. I still smell that tent. And I still feel the grip of that young boy's hand in mine, a ghost that never let go. You see, for a soldier, the war ends. For a medic, the casualties just keep coming forever. The cold gets into you in a way bullets never could. You can hear bullets, you can dive away from them, but the cold, it just settles in your bones like a silent thief, stealing the warmth, the feeling, even the will to move. That first winter on the Eastern Front, the winter of 41, wasn't just weather. It was a Third Army, and it was fighting all of us, German and Russian alike. Our fancy paraded ground uniforms might as well have been tissue paper. We'd stuff newspaper inside our coats, wrap our feet in rags until they were so swollen we could barely get our boots on. But it was never enough. Your breath would freeze on the wool of your scarf, this crust of ice around your mouth that made you feel like you were suffocating. And the silence, when the guns weren't firing, the sheer silence of that frozen wasteland was louder than any barrage. It was a heavy, dead sound, broken only by the moan of the wind across the endless white and the crunch of your own boots in the snow, a sound that felt like it could give away your position to the whole world. We'd stare across no man's land through binoculars that stuck to your cheeks if you weren't careful, and you'd see them, the Ivans, moving like shadows in their drab brown coats. At first, they were just Thatcher-does, targets. But after a few weeks of this hell, you started to see details. You'd see a soldier, no older than me, scrambling from one shell hole to another, his movements sluggish with the same cold that was crippling us. You'd see him fumble with his rifle, his fingers probably as numb and useless as my own. And this thought entered your head, a thought you couldn't ever say out loud to the lieutenant. They're just boys. They're sitting in their own frozen holes, dreaming of some warm village 1,000 miles away, just like we were. They're scared of the artillery, they're hungry, they miss their mothers or their girls. It was a dangerous thought, that one. It put a face on the enemy, and in a war you're not supposed to do that. The enemy has to stay a faceless thing, an idea, or else you can't do what they ask you to do. Then came the night the shooting stopped. It wasn't an order. There was no whistle, no command over the radio. It just happened. A patrol had gone out on our side, and one of theirs too, I suppose, and they'd met in the middle. There was a brief, vicious firefight in the twilight, the flashes of the rifles like little sparks in the gloom, and then silence. But this time, the silence was different. It was charged. We could hear them, the Russians, calling out. We could hear moaning, a wounded man crying out in that thick, muddy language of theirs. And one of our guys was out there too, a kid named Klaus from Hamburg. We could hear him whimpering. Mutter, mutter. It just ripped your heart out. Then one of their soldiers, bold as brass, just stood up from his hole. He didn't have his rifle. He had a white rag tied to a stick. He started walking slowly towards the sounds of the wounded. My heart was hammering against my ribs. We all had our rifles trained on him, one squeeze of the trigger, but nobody fired. Our sergeant, a hard old bird named Bauer who'd seen the Great War, he just muttered, "Hold your fire." And we did. Then one of our medics, a guy named France who used to be a tailor, he stood up too. He looked at us, then at the Russian with the flag, and he just started walking out there, his medical bag in his hand. And that was it. The truce began. For maybe an hour, there was no war on that little stretch of frozen hell. Germans and Russians, moving cautiously in the eerie half-light, retrieving our broken boys. I was ordered out to help France. The snow was so deep it came up to my thighs in places, and each step was a battle. And then I saw him, a Russian soldier leaning over one of his comrades. He looked up as I passed, dragging Klaus by his harness. His face was young, pinched with cold and fear, his eyelids red and raw. Our eyes met, just for a second. And in that second I didn't see a Bolshevik or a monster or the enemy I'd been taught to hate. I saw a kid just like me. A kid who was tired and scared, and just wanted this whole damn thing to be over. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. I nodded back. There were no words. There didn't need to be. It was just a flicker, a tiny spark of human respect in all that darkness, an understanding that down here in the mud and the blood, we were all just prisoners of the same nightmare. Then I looked away and kept dragging Klaus back to our lines, the moment gone as quickly as it came. That night, back in the relative safety of our dugout, the silence was heavier than ever. We got Klaus back, but he died an hour later. France just shook his head. Hypothermia had got him before the bullet wound did. We drank our terrible ersatz coffee, which tasted like burnt grain but was at least hot, and nobody spoke about what had happened. It was an unspoken rule. You didn't talk about the humanity of the other side. It was bad for morale, but you could see it in everyone's eyes. We'd all seen it. The spell was broken. They were men just like us. A couple of days later, we were rotating through a forward observation post set up in the skeleton of a bombed-out farmhouse. The place was just a shell, the roof gone, the walls pockmarked with shell fragments. It was my turn for sentry duty, staring out into the grey landscape, my feet feeling like blocks of ice. In a corner of the ruined room, tucked behind a pile of rubble, I saw it. A German ration can, a cube of corned beef, just sitting there on a relatively clean piece of timber. It was odd. It wasn't one of ours from our unit. I looked around, my senses suddenly on high alert. Was it booby-trapped? My hands were shaking as I picked it up. It was just a can. And then I saw, tucked underneath it, a packet of Russian cigarettes, papyrosi they call them, with their long, hollow cardboard mouthpieces. My blood ran cold, and not from the temperature. This was fraternization. This was a court-martial offense. This was, in the eyes of the High Command, treason. I stood there for a full minute, my heart pounding, staring at that packet. I looked out the window, scanning the Russian lines. Nothing, no movement. It was an invitation, a trade, corned beef for cigarettes. My stomach was growling. The rations were getting thinner every day. But more than the hunger, it was the gesture. It was a continuation of that silent truce. I quickly pocketed the cigarettes and left my own half-empty packet of German smokes next to where the can had been. The irrational fear was overwhelming. What if this was a trick? What if a sniper was watching this spot, waiting for some fool to take the bait? I felt a target painted on my back the whole way back to the main line. But I also felt something else, something I couldn't quite name. It was the feeling that the generals in their warm headquarters, moving flags on a map, were fighting a completely different war. Theirs was about ideology and territory. Ours, down here in the filth, was about survival. And sometimes, survival meant recognizing that the man in the hole across from you was playing the same terrible game. I never told anyone about the cigarettes. I smoked them slowly, one by one, each one tasting strange and harsh, but also like a secret. They were a reminder of that nard, that shared moment. It was a dangerous thought to hold on to, a little ember of warmth in the frozen emptiness of that front. It made the war make less sense, but it made me feel more human. We developed a dark humor to cope. We joked that Stalin and Hitler should be forced to fight each other with snowballs in no man's land, winner takes all. We talk about the food back home, describing our mothers, cooking in such detail it was like torture. Helmuth, a guy from Bavaria, he could describe a roasted goose with dumplings so vividly you could almost smell it, and we just sit there, silent, lost in our own memories of warmth and full bellies. That homesickness was a physical ache, sharper than any hunger pang. You'd look at a photograph of your family, the paper getting soft and worn from being handled so much, and it felt like looking at a ghost world, a life that didn't exist anymore. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the strange peace ended. The next morning the dawn was shattered not by the moaning wind, but by the shriek of incoming shells. Our artillery opened up, and then theirs answered. The ground shook, dirt and snow rained down on us in our dugout, and the world went back to being a roaring, concussive hell. I was back on the firing line, my rifle in my hands, the stock cold against my cheek. I was shooting at the shadows again, but I couldn't do it like I used to. Every time I squeezed the trigger, I wondered, was I shooting at the boy I'd exchanged nards with? Was that him rushing that machine gun nest? Was the man now lying dead in the snow the same one who left me those cigarettes? It was an unbearable weight. You're supposed to hate the enemy. You're supposed to want to kill them. But I found myself hoping, with a desperation that felt like a sin, that he was okay. That he was deep in his bunker, smoking a cigarette, thinking about his own home, waiting for the barrage to stop. It was a hope I could never, ever share with my buddies, or with the lieutenant, or in a letter home. It was my secret, a secret that made me feel more alone than ever, but also, in some small way, it kept a part of me alive, a part the war hadn't managed to freeze solid. That first day of real contact, that unspoken truce in the frozen wasteland, it didn't just change me, it split me in two. There was the soldier who did his duty, and there was the boy who remembered a shared glance in the snow, a boy who knew, with a certainty that would haunt him forever, that the real enemy was never the man in the opposite trench. The morning it happened, that morning, the sky was the color of washed-out slate, just starting to bleed a little pink at the edges like a faint bruise. I remember that so clearly because for a few stupid minutes I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was a sign of a new day, a great day, the day I'd finally prove myself. That was the boy I was. I had this feeling in my chest, a kind of buzzing like a trapped fly. They told us it was excitement, the thrill of finally getting into the fight. I know now it was just fear, the kind of fear that hasn't learned its own name yet. My uniform, God, that uniform. It was still stiff from the depot, the wool scratching my neck, the leather of my boots not yet broken in. I'd polished the buttons until I could see my own wide, foolish face in them. My pack was full, properly full for the first time, extra ammo, a loaf of black bread that was already hardening into a brick, a spare pair of socks my mother had knitted, and tucked right down at the bottom, next to my heart, a pamphlet. It was one of those things they handed out, all about the glory of the cause, the necessity of our struggle, how we were the shield of Europe. I'd read it so many times the folds were wearing through. I believed every word. We all did, or we pretended to, because what else did we have to hold on to? We were moving up to the line, a long, grey snake of men shuffling along a muddy track. The jokes were flying, the kind of dark, stupid humor that gets you through the marching. Klaus, the big fellow from Hamburg who could make anyone laugh, was imitating our sergeant major, puffing out his cheeks and barking orders in a perfect, gravelly mimicry. "Remember, boys, keep your heads down and your spirits up. The Bolsheviks will run at the first sight of German steel," we chuckled, a nervous, brittle sound. I was marching next to France. France wasn't like Klaus. He was quiet, from a small village in Bavaria. He had these gentle eyes, the kind you'd expect to see on a farmer looking over his herd, not a soldier. He showed me a photograph of his girlfriend, Liesel, a pretty girl with a shy smile. "When this is over," he said, his voice low, "I'm going to marry her. We'll have a little farm away from all this." He patted the pocket over his heart where the photo lived. I nodded, saying something stupid about how I'd visit, how we'd all get together after the victory parade. That's the word we always used. When? Never if. The very idea of if was a ghost we wouldn't acknowledge. The sound changed gradually. At first, it was just a dull, distant thudding, like a far-off thunderstorm that never quite arrives. Then, as we got closer, the thunder separated into distinct sounds, the crump of artillery, the staccato popping of small arms fire. The air started to taste different, a gritty, sulphurous tang that coated the back of your throat. The road became a quagmire, churned up by the wheels of 1,000 vehicles and the boots of 10,000 men who had gone before us. We passed a burnt-out half-track, a blackened, skeletal wreck pushed to the side of the road, and for the first time, a real silence fell over our little group. The joking stopped. You could see it in the eyes of the veterans we passed coming the other way, men being rotated out of the line for a few days' rest. They didn't look at us. They just trudged past, their faces grey with exhaustion and dirt, their eyes fixed on some point 1,000 yards behind us. They had a hollowed-out look, like something vital had been scooped from inside them. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but I pushed it down. I told myself they were just tired. They'd seen things, sure, but we were fresh, we were keen, we were different. We reached the reserve trench, a ditch full of muddy water and the stink of unwashed men and damp earth. Sergeant who greeted us was a different breed from our training sergeants. He was lean, all sinew and sharp edges, his face a roadmap of scars and tired lines. He didn't give us a speech. He just looked us over, his eyes lingering on each of our fresh, unlined faces for a second too long. "The Ivans are dug in across that field," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "There's a machine gun nest in that copse of birch trees. It's been giving us trouble. Your job is to silence it. Fix bayonets. When the whistle goes, you go over the top. Don't bunch up. Keep moving. If you stop, you die." That was it. That was our entire briefing. The reality of it was so stark, so different from the tactical diagrams they'd drawn for us in training, that it felt like a physical blow. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my bayonet, the cold steel clicking into place on the muzzle of my rifle. I looked over at France. He was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped his own rifle. He gave me a tiny, grim nod. It was the last real look we shared. Then the whistle came. It wasn't a grand, cinematic sound. It was shrill, piercing, the kind of sound that cuts through everything and goes straight to the primitive part of your brain. For a second, nobody moved. It was as if we were all frozen, suspended in that terrible noise. Then a roar went up, a sound that came from deep in the throats of the men around me, a sound of fear and fury all mixed together, and we were scrambling up the muddy parapet, over the top into the open. The world exploded. That's the only way to describe it. One moment there was the relative safety of the trench, the next pure chaos. The air was suddenly full of a sound I'd never heard before, a sound that I will hear until the day I die, the ripping cloth sound of a machine gun. It's a vicious, mechanical noise, and it doesn't sound like it's firing bullets. It sounds like it's tearing the very fabric of the air apart. I was running, stumbling through the churned-up earth, my feet sinking into the mud. Men were falling around me. They didn't fall like they do in the movies, with a dramatic cry and a graceful collapse. They just dropped. One moment they were there, a running, shouting shape. The next they were a crumpled heap on the ground. I saw a man to my left spin around and sit down hard, like he'd slipped, a look of stupid surprise on his face before a dark red stain spread across his tunic. I was shouting, screaming, though I don't know what. My training evaporated. There was no aiming, no careful firing. It was just run, and when you saw a shape move in the distance, you pointed your rifle in that general direction and pulled the trigger, the bolt jerking back and forth, the empty cartridge cases clinking at your feet. The smell was overwhelming cordite, mud, and something else, something coppery and sweet that I would later know as the smell of blood. I tripped over something and fell face-first into a shell crater half-filled with foul, oily water. As I pushed myself up, sputtering, I saw him, France. He was maybe 10 meters ahead of me, crouched behind a small mound of earth. He turned his head, looking back towards the trench, his eyes wide with terror. He saw me, and for a split second there was a flicker of recognition, a silent plea. And then it happened. A burst of that ripping cloth fire stitched a line across the mound. One of the rounds caught him high in the chest. It didn't look like a bullet wound. It was like a part of him just vanished. He made no sound. He just folded, collapsing into the mud like a puppet with its strings cut. The gentle eyes from the photograph, the eyes that dreamed of a farm with Liesel, were wide open, staring at the grey sky, but there was nothing behind them. Nothing at all. Something broke in me then. The last shred of the eager recruit, the boy who believed in glory, it just shattered. What took over was something else, something ancient and primal. It wasn't courage. It was a pure, white-heart animal instinct for survival. Fear became a physical thing, a taste of pennies in my mouth, a coldness in my bowels. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a creature, scrambling, crawling, burrowing into the mud. I fired my rifle without aiming. I threw a grenade without even looking where it landed. My only thought, my only purpose, was to not end up like France, to not become an empty, staring thing in the mud. The noise, the smell, the taste of dirt and fear, it all blurred into a single, terrifying sensation of being trapped in a nightmare. I saw things in that charge that my mind has tried to bury for 50 years, but they're always there, just beneath the surface. The way a shell could lift a man off his feet and scatter him over a 20-meter radius. The sound of a wounded man crying for his mother, a high, keening wail that cut through the explosions. The sight of a veteran, a man who had seemed so tough back in the trench, curled up in a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably, his rifle discarded beside him. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughterhouse, and we were the cattle. I don't know how long it lasted. It could have been 5 minutes or 5 hours. Time lost all meaning. Eventually, the firing died down. Our artillery, what was left of it, had found the range of the machine gun nest, or maybe they had just run out of ammunition. An order was shouted, hoarse and barely audible, to advance and secure the enemy position. I moved forward on autopilot, my body numb, my mind a blank. We reached the Russian trench. It was a mirror image of ours, but worse, filled with the detritus of a fierce fight. I stumbled down into it, my legs buckling underneath me. I just sat there, my back against the muddy wall of the trench, my rifle lying across my lap. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even form a coherent thought. My uniform was soaked through, heavy with mud and water and something else. I looked down at my hands. They were caked in dirt, and there on my sleeve was a dark, rust-colored stain that wasn't mine. France's blood. Or maybe it was someone else's. It didn't matter. It was the blood of a boy who had been alive that morning, a boy with a photograph in his pocket and a future he would never see. I sat there for a long time, just staring at nothing. The sounds of mopping up operations went on around me, a sporadic shot, shouts in German and Russian, but it all seemed muffled, distant, like I was listening to it from the bottom of a well. I became aware of someone sitting next to me. It was one of the veterans, a corporal with a week's growth of beard and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't say a word. He just offered me a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. I took it, my own hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. He lit it for me with a battered lighter. I took a drag, the smoke harsh in my raw throat. I looked at him properly then, and I saw it. The hollow-eyed outlook, the 1,000-yard stare, the vacancy in his eyes that I had noticed on the men marching back from the line. And in that moment, with a chill that went deeper than the mud and the cold, I knew. I looked into his eyes, and I saw my own reflection. I had it too. The boy who had joked with Klaus and dreamed of glory that morning was gone. He had been left out there in the mud with France. What was left was this hollowed-out thing, this vessel of shock and dread. I had become one of them in a single afternoon. After a while, I fumbled in my pocket. My fingers, still numb, brushed against the spare pair of socks, the hard bread, and then found it. The pamphlet. The paper was damp, the words about glory and destiny and the shield of Europe smudged and illegible. I pulled it out. I looked at it, this little piece of paper that had once meant so much, that had fueled my devotion, my patriotism. It was a lie. It was a cheap, filthy lie that had brought me to this hellhole, that had gotten France killed, that had scraped my soul raw. There was no glory here. There was only mud and blood and the empty eyes of the dead. There was only the cold, sickening knowledge that you had somehow survived when better men had not. I crumpled the pamphlet into a tight ball and threw it into the filth at the bottom of the trench. I watched as it soaked up the muddy water, turning into a shapeless pulp. That was the death of my idealism. It died as quickly and as quietly as France had. In its place was a new understanding, a single, stark goal that would see me through the next 3 brutal years. Keep your head down, do what you must to survive, and try, God help you, to keep the man next to you alive for one more day. The cause didn't matter anymore. The fatherland was an abstract concept that felt 1,000,000 miles away. The only thing that was real was the trembling hand of the veteran next to me, the shared cigarette, and the chilling certainty that the person I was yesterday was a ghost.